Hello, folks, and thanks for listening. This is the first ever podcast that I've done. I thought that I'd add it to my Substack to let people who prefer to listen and read, and so that we can reach as many people as possible. So this will be weekly, and it will go on for months and months, and it will be everything Epstein. So everything that you need to know about Epstein right from the very beginning, so that you are fully up to date and educated on this entire scandal. We're going to start today by reading through one of my articles. Now, in the future, I'll be also doing some Q&As. I'll be doing some off-the-cuff pieces where I discuss latest developments. But today we're going to start from the very, very beginning, and we're going to talk about how Jeffrey Epstein made his millions. Now, I'm not going to go too much into his early childhood or anything like that right now, just focusing on the money. Follow the money, as they say. But you can read about his actual biography in depth in my upcoming book, Naked Lies, The Epstein Scandal That Rocked the Royals and Troubled Trump. So let's get straight into it. This one is titled Maths Teacher to Millionaire, the true story of how Jeffrey Epstein made his money and a connection with Russia. Jeffrey Epstein began his adult life in a classroom. Born in Brooklyn in 1953 to a working-class family, the son of a Parks Department employee, he emerged in the mid-1970s as a mathematics teacher at the elite Dalton School on Manhattan's Upper East Side. He'd attended college but never completed a degree. No financial qualification, no law training, no MBA. What he did possess, however, colleagues later said, was an unusual fluency with numbers and abstraction. He could see patterns quickly, solve complex problems in his head, move unencumbered through equations that others needed paper to navigate. Dalton was not merely a school, it was a gateway into Manhattan's political and financial aristocracy. Its classrooms were filled with children of ambassadors, hedge fund managers, cabinet members, and Wall Street executives. One of those parents was Alan Greenberg, the powerful chief executive of Bear Stearns, and in 1976, Epstein left teaching and joined Bear Stearns as a junior assistant to a trader. Within 4 years, though, he had risen to the unlikely status of limited partner, a promotion that stunned those who understood the firm's rigid hierarchies. Some colleagues later suggested he had a peculiar gift for structuring trades and identifying arbitrage. Others said his real talent lay in cultivating wealthy clients and embedding himself in their confidence. In 1981, at 27 years old, Epstein left Bear Stearns under circumstances that were never publicly fully explained. He didn't depart with scandal, though. He did not depart with millions, but he did leave with something far more valuable: contacts. Within a year, he'd established J. Epstein and Company, presenting it as an exclusive consultancy firm that served only clients with net worths exceeding $1 billion. It was a complete myth, a PR campaign designed to manufacture prestige through scarcity. In reality, Epstein at that stage had no such billionaire clientele whatsoever. His first serious financial alliance, though, came through Stephen Hoffenberg, a volatile New York financier who ran a company called Tower Financial. Tower marketed itself as an accounts receivable lender. In truth, it had metastasized into a vast Ponzi scheme. Hoffenberg later pleaded guilty to what prosecutors described as one of the largest investor frauds in American history, involving losses of more than $450 million. And it is believed that Epstein pocketed some of this money and benefited from that scam. Hoffenberg was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, and he did testify under oath that Epstein was deeply involved in Tower's inner workings, managing cash flows, structuring transactions, and keeping the scheme solvent. Epstein himself was arrested in connection with related financial offences, and he was briefly jailed in Florida, but then suddenly the charges against him were dismissed. Hoffenberg went to prison. Epstein walked free. It was the first moment where Epstein stood beside criminal exposure and emerged untouched. It was also the moment his fortunes pivoted decisively towards Leslie Wexner. By the early 1990s, the businessman and owner of Victoria's Secret had become the central pillar of Epstein's financial ascent. In 1991, Wexner granted Epstein a sweeping power of attorney, giving him control over checks, loans, property transfers, and asset restructuring across Wexner's personal and corporate empire. Epstein essentially became, in practice, the financial steward of billions. In 1998, Wexner transferred the East 71st Street mansion to Epstein for a limited liability company. Now, this is the famous building, the home of Jeffrey Epstein, right in the heart of New York. The recorded price was nominal, just $1. The 7-story townhouse, one of the largest private residences in Manhattan, passed into Epstein's hands under the legal authority that it settled debts owed for years of financial services, although that comes across as somewhat of an exaggeration, if not an all-out lie. The visual symbolism, however, was unmistakable. A former schoolteacher now in possession of a fortress of generational wealth. Around the same period, Epstein began assembling his physical offshore infrastructure. Through shell companies, he purchased Little St. James in the US Virgin Islands for roughly $8 million and later acquired neighbouring Great St. James, another island, at far greater cost. Funding sources were never fully publicly disclosed. The transactions were routed through offshore entities that permanently obscured the origin of the capital. How did he suddenly get his hands on such huge sums to make these extravagant purchases? Well, clickbait merchants, YouTubers, and glorified bloggers at the Daily Beast like to insinuate that he was working as some kind of shady international spy, but the likely truth is far less interesting, though no less scandalous. He stole it. Wexner claimed that whilst Epstein was controlling his financial affairs, Epstein swindled him out of at least $46 million. Wexner's allegations focus on that $46 million of investments in a Wexner charitable fund controlled by Epstein. Wexner said that as he severed his relationship with Epstein later on, he discovered Epstein had returned only a portion of the money in the fund. He declined, though, to say if he'd reported the loss to authorities. He did say, "We discovered that he had misappropriated vast sums of money from me and my family. This was, frankly, a tremendous shock, even though it clearly pales in comparison to the unthinkable allegations against him now." By 1996, Epstein formally shifted the core registration of his business to the Virgin Islands, establishing Financial Trust Company and later Southern Trust. Under the Virgin Islands Economic Development Commission program, his companies qualified for extraordinary tax privileges, corporate income tax reductions of up to 90%, exemptions from gross receipts taxes, reduced excise duties, and rebates on withholding taxes. The US Virgin Islands occupies a peculiar position in American law. It's under US sovereignty, but treated as a separate tax jurisdiction. For Epstein, this meant that advisory fees earned from mainland US clients could be booked through Virgin Islands entities and legally taxed at a fraction of what would have been owed in New York. It was offshore without appearing foreign. This was the same logic exploited by global tycoons whose empires run through island jurisdictions, including figures such as Richard Branson, whose companies for decades have routed ownership, licensing, and profits through low-tax island regimes. And Epstein mastered both worlds at once, the private offshore universe of international billionaires and the quasi-domestic offshore territory used by American elites. Internal banking records later showed Epstein routing massive wire transfers through Virgin Islands entities labelled only as consulting or services, with layered shell companies shielding beneficial ownership. Prosecutors would later describe his corporate web as a structure deliberately designed to conceal transactions and frustrate scrutiny. The island was not merely a destination, not merely a paradise. It was a financial instrument. Construction contracts, aviation fuel, maritime services, payrolls, security and logistics all flowed through the same tax-advantaged architecture. Visitors arrived by private plane into a jurisdiction engineered for reduced oversight. The physical environment itself became part of the tax shelter. This was the service that Epstein sold. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he'd added billionaire Leon Black as a second core client. Between 1999 and 2018, Epstein collected roughly $490 million in fees, which, with approximately $200 million tied to Wexner entities alone and about $170 million to Leon Black. For a supposed billionaire advisor, this was an extraordinarily narrow client base, but it delivered huge sums of money for him. Epstein did not compound his wealth through markets. He compounded it through concealment. He monetized invisibility. Each offshore structure he built for clients mirrored those he built for himself. His fiduciary role and personal enrichment became indistinguishable. Epstein used to say he invested in people, not companies, not public offerings, but flesh and blood access. Billionaires, officials, scientists, heads of universities, men who chaired boards, men who drafted policy, men who could change tax codes with just a phone call. Men who had so much money that it came with incredibly high tax bills they didn't want to pay, at least not in full if they didn't have to. And that's where Epstein came in. To maximise his own income and reduce his tax outgoings, Epstein obtained generous tax concessions, like I've said. His companies were approved for a program that cut corporate income tax by as much as 90%, reduced gross receipts and excise taxes, and gave him exemptions and credits that dramatically lowered his federal liability. The result was that fees paid to him by Wexner and Black could be booked through entities in St. Thomas and Little St. James, transforming tens of millions that would once have been taxed in the continental United States into lightly taxed Caribbean revenue. In other words, simple terms, Epstein, by exploiting tax loopholes, could get richer and richer. And he did. There is no public evidence that Epstein was some sort of trading genius delivering spectacular returns. What the record shows instead is that his value lay in discretion and structure. He built and tended opaque vehicles that let clients reduce their tax bills, move money offshore, and keep assets hard to trace. Here and there you see the same logic applied to his own wealth. Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands was held for a company apparently created for that single purpose. Aircraft were owned by entities with nondescript names. Philanthropic foundations in New York and New Mexico gave him a respectable public-facing profile while acting conveniently as yet more legal containers for money. In one complaint, Virgin Islands authorities described his network of companies as a web designed to conceal the true nature of transactions and allow the movement of funds with minimal scrutiny. And that architecture would later become a central issue in lawsuits brought by the US Virgin Islands government after Epstein's death. Regulators alleged that Epstein's entire territorial presence had been structured to exploit tax benefits while facilitating crimes that the territory had failed to stop. The Virgin Islands eventually reached a large settlement with his estate, reclaiming a portion of the tax benefits and levying penalties for years of regulatory failure. It is the same mechanic over and over. Build a structure that keeps the rich out of sight, then charge for the keys. Epstein did not manufacture a commodity or build a platform. His trade was plausible deniability. You'd think that a conviction for sex crimes involving a minor would burn that trade to the ground. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to Florida to soliciting prostitution from a minor after a woman named Haley Robson, who was recruited by Virginia Giuffre, found the minor in her local area of West Palm Beach. She took her to Epstein and told her to lie that she was over 18 before encouraging her to engage in sexual activity. Epstein served a short sentence under a work release scheme that let him leave the county jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He registered as a sex offender, and that's important. For most people, that would have meant permanent exile from polite society. But for Epstein, it was just merely a pause. The calendar and email records that have emerged in recent years sketch what came next. Within a very short time after his release, Epstein was back hosting dinners at his Manhattan townhouse, flying to Europe on private jets, and sitting across from men whose names would later reappear in the so-called Epstein files. He continued to donate money to prestigious institutions. Harvard never returned millions he had already given them. His name was removed from some spaces, but researchers still used funds that traced back to his accounts. At MIT's Media Lab, administrators quietly courted his donations even after they were warned about his conviction, discussing internally how to list his contributions in a way that obscured his identity while keeping the cash. Epstein kept his seat in the intellectual salons that mattered to him. Academics shuttled through his living room to talk about artificial intelligence, physics, cosmology, and the future of human cognition, sometimes leaving with checks. Politicians and policy figures kept their own kinds of appointments. Calendars unsealed through litigation show that William Burns, now director of the CIA, but then a former ambassador and deputy secretary of state, met Epstein multiple times in Washington and New York during the years when Burns was between official posts. Email traffic and later investigations revealed that Epstein actively cultivated senior officials from central banks, finance ministries, and international organizations, offering introductions social access, and occasionally the use of his aircraft. Epstein also maintained close ties to figures in Israeli politics and defense technology. He partnered financially with a former Israeli prime minister in a cybersecurity firm that marketed surveillance tools to governments. He hosted delegations of foreign intelligence-linked entrepreneurs at his properties. This blending of finance, intelligence-adjacent technology, and elite social life was not an accident. It was his operating environment. Noam Chomsky's name appears in Epstein's private scheduling records, attached to meetings in New York and invitations to dinner at the townhouse. Later, when congressional committees released a tranche of Epstein's correspondence, the material included personal letters in which Epstein and Chomsky exchanged views on politics and philosophy, along with routine arrangements about travel and visits. Journalistic summaries of those emails note that Chomsky's wife sent Epstein friendly messages and that at one point an Epstein-linked account wired around $270,000 to assist Chomsky financially during his divorce. Chomsky has not denied the relationship. He's argued that it is his business, his own business, whom he meets, and that the money that did not come, he claims that the money did not come from Epstein personally. But Chomsky was not alone. Many scientists rationalized their presence in Epstein's orbit by telling themselves that he was a sinner who had essentially paid his debt to society and that refusing his checks would only harm their own work. And that is completely understandable. Others admitted privately that Epstein's dinners were unrivaled opportunities for networking at the highest level. The gravitational pull of money and proximity to power proved stronger than reputational risk. And when you understand how resilient his standing remained in Western elite circles and the famous and influential figures that surrounded him, you begin to see why someone in the murky depths of Moscow might decide that this disgraced American financier was still very much worth talking to. Excuse me. Sergei Balyakov did not look like a spy. In official biographies, he was a soft-spoken economic official, a man of meetings and plenary sessions and investment forums. What those biographies did not advertise was his education at the infamous FSB Academy, the training ground for Russia's intelligence operatives and security bureaucrats. Investigators later reconstructed his path: study at the academy in the 1990s, service in the border troops, then a steady rise through roles tied to economic policy and investor relations. By the early 2010s, he had become Deputy Minister of Economic Development and an assistant to powerful figures such as Elvira Nabiullina, later the long-serving governor of Russia's central bank, and first Deputy Prime Minister Igor Shuvvalov. Then he moved into a role that brought him even closer to the Kremlin showcase: head of the foundation that organizes the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the annual gathering Russia uses to court global investors and project economic legitimacy under sanctions. If SPIEF is Russia's Davos, Belyakov was one of the men behind the guest list, and his FSB Academy background meant he was the kind of technocrat who understood that investment climate and operational leverage could mean more than just taxes and infrastructure. By 2014, Epstein and Belyakov were in contact. They exchanged emails and gifts. After one of their meetings in the spring of that year, Belyakov wrote to Epstein that few people, quote, can open new horizons and prospects like him, and thanked him for a nice gift. What that gift was remains unspecified. During the exchanges, Epstein proposed recruiting high-profile Western guests for SPIEF and ordered advice on how Russia might weather Western sanctions imposed after its illegal annexation of Crimea. By 2015, the relationship had matured enough that Epstein felt comfortable writing to Belyakov as if he were a fixer. In a July email, Epstein wrote that he needed a favor and identified a Russian girl from Moscow, Gazelle Ganieva. He said she was attempting to blackmail a group of powerful businessmen in New York and described the situation as bad for business. He noted that she had just arrived in New York and was staying at the Four Seasons on 57th Street. He ended with one word: suggestions? Belyakov replied with what read like an intelligence-style profile. He outlined her business patterns, reported that she had no powerful patron, noted that she had been involved in numerous hard stories, and concluded that denying her access to the United States would pose a great threat to her business. There is no public record that any immigration or visa action followed, but the message is unambiguous. A convicted American sex offender was seeking help from a Russian security-trained official to manage a reputational and sexual finance crisis using geopolitical leverage rather than courts. The documents showed Epstein advising Belyakov on broader economic strategy as well. He proposed financial instruments, credit mechanisms, and even a new multinational currency model as ways for Russia and allied economies to circumvent Western financial pressure. He offered to use his personal network to bring Western elites, investors, and technologists into sanctioned Russian forums, packaging attendance itself as a form of legitimacy. This was not ideological alignment, it was transactional utility. Years later, in 2021, Gazelle Geneva publicly accused Leon Black of years of sexual coercion and abuse. She described Epstein as Black's closest confidant and alleged that she had been taken to Epstein's Palm Beach home while Epstein was technically incarcerated, where his assistant attempted to pressure her into sex with him. She alleges she refused. Her allegations described a pattern of contact, pressure, and money that stretched back across multiple years. She alleged that Black paid her for sex and companionship while attempting to control her movements and silence her through payments. She alleged sadistic conduct, psychological coercion, and the constant presence of Epstein in Black's world as both confidant and facilitator. She sued Black for sexual assault and human trafficking. Black countersued. A campaign emerged portraying her as a Russian intelligence officer based on a misidentified name from a foreign intelligence leak. Investigators later established conclusively, though, that the alleged officer and Genevieve were not the same person. No intelligence agency has ever substantiated any claim that Genevieve worked for Russian security services. Her lawsuit was dismissed, however, in 2023, not because a court ruled her abuse claims completely false, but because she had previously signed a non-disclosure agreement with Black, accompanied by a payment of about $9.5 million, and had not returned the money. On strict contract grounds alone, the lawsuit was barred. The underlying allegations were never tested before a jury. Another Russian vector surfaced in 2018 as Donald Trump prepared for his summit with Vladimir Putin. Epstein wrote to a European intermediary claiming that Russia's late UN ambassador Vitaly Churkin had understood Trump after conversations with him, and that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov could gain insight into Trump by speaking with Epstein directly. The message positioned Epstein as a private interpreter of American presidential behavior at a moment when intelligence agencies and foreign ministries worldwide were still struggling to read Trump's intentions. There is no evidence that Lavrov responded. Churkin was already dead, but the email again shows Epstein attempting to sell himself as a back channel between global power centers. Around the same time, Epstein privately claimed that he had flown to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin and had been providing services over the final decade of his life. No independent corroboration of such a meeting exists, I have to stress, but placed beside the documented correspondence with Belyakov and the overture to Lavrov, the claim fits a consistent pattern of self-presentation as a geopolitical intermediary operating in the shadowy spaces between finance, intelligence, and diplomacy. Investigators later concluded that Epstein's assistance to Belyakov and his circle extended into advising Russian economic officials on navigating sanctions and continuing to recruit elite Western participation for Russian investment forums during periods of diplomatic isolation. SPIFE is not merely an economic conference. It is a stage on which Russia performs normality for domestic and foreign audiences. Escort agencies openly recruit for the event. Western executives drink champagne with sanctioned oligarchs within sight of security officers trained in surveillance and counterintelligence. Hotel corridors fill with translators, lobbyists, fixers, and itinerant models. It is an environment where compromat does not need to be manufactured. It only needs to be collected. In such a world, Epstein's core talents were unusually valuable. Discreet money movement, reputation laundering, and controlled social access. He had supplied those exact services to American billionaires for decades. Now, the same skills were being quietly repurposed at the intersection of sanctions, propaganda, and geopolitical influence. No court has formally declared that Epstein worked as a Russian intelligence asset, but the documentary record now shows that he cultivated, advised, and sought assistance from figures at the heart of Russia's post-sanctions economic outreach. Epstein's fortune grew out of helping a tiny class of ultra-rich clients hide and move their wealth. His social power survived a criminal conviction because the institutions that benefited from his money chose not to exile him. His Russian contacts emerged precisely when Russia needed bridges to Western capital and legitimacy most strongly. Seen together, they form a single continuous strategy: access in exchange for invisibility and money. The Black Door on East 71st Street has been repainted now. When I visited it last year, its new owners were renovating it throughout. The island in the Caribbean has been sold, the planes have new registrations, but the offshore system that produced Jeffrey Epstein remains intact. Trusts still hum beneath the global economy. Conferences still pair oligarchs with intellectuals beneath chandeliers. Men trained in security services still move quietly between state power and private capital, always looking for the next intermediary. What the documents now show is not that Epstein was an anomaly. They show that he was a mechanism. So that's the first episode of my podcast, and thanks so much for listening. We've got through the financial bit that I admit is not always the most interesting of parts, although I think you'll admit also that Jeffrey Epstein led quite a crooked life, and an interesting one to say the least. He was no doubt a genius, but he was a crook. And next, in our next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to shift over to the allegations against him. So the juicy part. We're going to go from his life whilst he was a multi-millionaire, jet-setting all over the place, the girls that he had around him, his playboy lifestyle, and we're going to get to that point where allegations began to emerge. And I'm going to do a deep dive and explain to you the full context around those allegations. So again, thanks for listening. Please give this a share, and I will catch up with you soon.